Welcome, everyone, to this first edition of Church and State of 2023. I'm Brian McCall, and as always, I'm joined by Chris Ferrara. I hope you had a great Christmas and New Year, Chris.
Yeah, it's my birthday tomorrow.
Oh, well, happy birthday. You were
On
born
the
on the Epiphany.
Epiphany.
The Epiphany. You were made manifest to the world on January 6th.
Well, I'm happy to come here today to discuss the crumbling edifices of both the church and the state.
Yes, that they certainly are. Well, today, as we're filming this on the 5th of January, the day, now I'll always remember, the day before Chris's birthday. And today in Rome, the mortal remains of Joseph Ratzinger, Pope Benedict XVI, were given, it's hard to call them a solemn requiem in the Novus Ordo, but we're given a final farewell and blessing. And while we talk, I'll just run some footage of that from the Vatican TV. There's no sound, but just so you can see some of the images there. Really an unprecedented funeral because normally you wouldn't have a reigning pope presiding over or being present at the funeral of another pope, which really just reminds all of us of the really unprecedented final act of Benedict XVI, this resignation. I did do a little research. The last time a pope blessed the body of another pope or interred them was when Pius VI was reinterred. So he had been held hostage by Napoleon in prison, died in prison. And 2 years later, his body was brought back to Rome. And the then pope reinterred his body. But that's really obviously very different from this scenario here. But it was kind of a strange ceremony, almost ignored by the whole world. I think aside from the prime minister of Italy, very few world leaders attended, current world leaders. They seemed, the Catholic president, Joe Biden, said he wasn't going to attend, although there was some indications that Ratzinger asked him not to be there at his funeral, which is interesting.
I wouldn't be surprised. Well, he's not the Pope, so he's a deceased bishop.
Yes.
And that's the way it should be. But I note that there were 60,000 people or so who processed past the Pope as he lay in state in the Vatican.
Yes.
And I've heard rumors to the effect that Francis was rather irritated at the amount of attention the emeritus Pope is getting. But, if Bergoglio resigns, then we were under a threat of having to set up a papal 401k plan, but now we only have one pope. So,
well, again, liturgically, I don't understand the red vestments either. I mean, even in the New Rite, black would be the traditional vestments for a funeral, but the New Rite is usually white. So I don't even get what all the red is. It's just kind of, I don't know, it's Christmas time, so maybe they cut out the
red. Who knows? With the Novus Ordo, there's an innovation every day.
Exactly. But again, it's obviously someone's death is a time to reflect on them. And I found it interesting. That Ratzinger, Benedict XVI, died during the octave of Christmas. It's a very consoling fact. He seems to have died a holy death. He received the final sacraments, we were told. But kind of a really mixed historical record, I guess I'd say. So how would you sum up the life of this man?
Here's my take on it with Benedict. It isn't so much documents, reaffirmations of doctrine and dogma, paper, in other words, that we need from a Roman pontiff. We know what the church teaches. The church has taught these things constantly down through the centuries. So we look for the Pope to simply maintain that deposit of the faith. So what we really want from a Pope in the midst of this crisis is acts of governance to set things right. Now, the one thing that Benedict did, well, two things actually, he lifted the excommunications of the Pius X bishops, which were never really well founded. And more importantly, infinitely more important, he liberated the Latin Mass from its ridiculous Babylonian captivity of 40 years. The pretend suppression was finally revealed as such when he said in his letter to the world's bishops that the traditional Mass was never juridically abrogated, and in principle was always permitted, which is exactly what traditionalists have been arguing for 40 years. Now, by those two acts of governance, he began what would have been, sooner or later, a complete restoration of the liturgy, because, as we know, the Latin Mass movement is a young people's movement. They want the real thing. The Novus Ordo is for old ladies in frosted hair handing out communion and doddering 80-year-old priests and bishops who are the remnants of the Vatican II Big Bang event, and they cling to their dreams of the renewed church, which they've destroyed, humanly speaking. Of course, it will never actually be fully destroyed. So it's a young people's movement, and he sparked that. And I remember the pilgrimages, the Chartres pilgrimages of the remnant, every year marching from Paris to Chartres. It was always a problem finding a place to say the traditional mass. But with a flick of his pen, that whole situation changed in Europe. Everywhere we went was, oh, no problem. Here's your altar. You can say the traditional mass whenever you want, because the Pope now permits it. And what did Francis do? As soon as he got the intimation that this was a young people's movement and that his beloved and delusional renewal of Vatican II was a failure, he decided to target precisely that young people's movement by rescinding, this is incredible, rescinding Summorum Pontificum, the legislation, the universal prescription of his own living predecessor. How's that for arrogance and insensitivity and cruelty and arbitrary power? We've never seen anything like it.
Well, and we did learn
my take on Benedict is, I call it the Benedictine respite. Sure, his history is that of a modernist, let's face it. At Vatican II, he was making modernist noises. But then again, being Ratzinger, he also had criticisms of the Vatican II documents. So in terms of theology, he was a mixed bag. But as Pope, his acts of governance had a tremendous positive impact on the life of the church, which is exactly why the current occupant of the chair of Peter has decided to stamp them out.
Well, and again, as we look at some images from Rome, I actually have a slightly different maybe take. I think I agree with everything you said. I think for whatever he did, I think Summorum Pontificum is probably the most notable act of government that he did. But I actually would like to focus on the man. I think some things we've seen in his life and some revelations from his secretary, Monsignor Garnswine, I think really reveal who he was. I think, notwithstanding being a modernist or having modernist tendencies or having some confusion on doctrine, I think he was a very human person who really cared about and had decent human sympathy for the way people were treated. And I know Michael Davies always said this about him, because he met with Cardinal Ratzinger many times during the John Paul II years when Michael was both for the Latin Mass Society and International Una Voce. And what struck him is Cardinal Ratzinger really felt it was wrong the way traditionalists were treated. And it wasn't even so much on the principles about the traditional mass, but how can you just treat people who are doing what Catholics did for years so badly? And I think there's likewise with the society. I think in his dealings with Archbishop Lefebvre in 1987 and 1988, and then in what he ultimately did in 2009, I think even though he disagreed with them, and remember Archbishop Lefebvre said, Your Eminence, we can't work with you. You don't believe in Christ the King anymore. Notwithstanding those disagreements, he just felt, why are we doing these things to these poor small group of people who are not doing anything wrong, right? And I think that also comes across in Summorum Pontificum, that he just really understood the brutality of the radical progressivist agenda and what it really meant to people. And one of the other things that Monsignor Garswine revealed in these recent days since Benedict passing is that he broke his heart when he read Traditionis Custodes. He sort of said he wept over it, and that he, before his death, sent a letter to the priestly fraternity of St. Peter. Sort of, again, we don't know, he didn't reveal the contents, but essentially consoling them and encouraging them in light of this persecution. So I think he, for notwithstanding the contradictions maybe in thinking, he definitely had a human heart and an empathy that you don't usually see you certainly don't see in Pope Francis.
Yeah, and because of his compassion and his sense of justice, which animated these acts of governance, the lifting of the excommunications and the liberation of the traditional mass, he was, in all likelihood, hounded out of office. And who knows what precisely was done to get him to resign. I'm sure he was under some sort of threat, either to himself or to his brother, because of rumors concerning his brother. Who knows? But he'd said at the outset of his pontificate, "Pray for me that I may not flee for fear of the wolves," because he knew he was surrounded by wolves in the Vatican. Now, this is the Pope entering into his papal office, telling the world this fact
Yes.
about life in the Vatican, that if you're in the Vatican, you're surrounded by wolves. And they drove him from office. But, in terms of the distinction between doctrine and personality, I suppose you have a point, because when you consider the fact that even though he liberated the traditional Mass, Benedict never once offered it as Pope, at least not publicly. So he would say, and did say in the pertinent documents, in Summorum and the letter to the world's bishops, that what was sacred once is sacred for us and cannot be entirely prohibited or put aside. It deserves its rightful place in the church. It's part of our liturgical inheritance. It's part of the patrimony of the church handed down through the centuries. He said all of that, and yet, in an implicit recognition that he was in the midst of a revolution, he wouldn't say the traditional Mass. Why not? If it's sacred for us and deserves its rightful place, why wouldn't the Pope, the very head of the church as a human institution, say the traditional Mass ever and under any circumstances? So it seems that he felt
fear of the wolves, perhaps.
Yeah, fear of the wolves.
Yes.
Because if he had offered the traditional Mass, that would have been the end of the revolution. All the Pope would have had to do, strictly speaking, was to offer that Mass as an example to the world, and the world would have followed. But he didn't go that far. But what he did do had a tremendous positive impact, as I've said, and that is why the current occupant of the Chair of Peter is attempting to stamp it out with vicious and brutal exercises of papal authority. At the same time, he talks about decentralizing the church and the synodal process. This is all just window dressing for the naked will of Pope Bergoglio.
Well, it is interesting, and it is that statement, which again always seemed odd at the time, pray that I do not flee for fear of the wolves, which seems to be basically what he did in his resignation. He fled. We don't know exactly who the wolves were or what the fear, what the threat, as you say, was. Maybe history will eventually unveil that. But in that sense, for all the good he did, he does have to bear some of that responsibility for the emergence of Bergoglio when he did. That, but for his resignation, if you look at it now, he lived another 10 years.
Yep.
He could have reigned. Again, recently he's looked somewhat feeble, but he's actually even in most recent months looked much healthier than John Paul II did for the many last years of his reign. So he does bear, I think, that responsibility for inflicting.
Well, let's remember the anecdote. It may be apocryphal, but I tend to think it's true that he said to someone in the midst of a papal audience, "My authority ends outside that door."
Yes.
Because they would simply not implement with his will. I don't believe that. I think he could have insisted upon the implementation of his will.
Yes.
Again, by leading by example, offering the traditional Mass and telling the bishops of the world, you should do it too. He could have done that.
He could have.
And then, of course, as you say, he resigned. He abandoned his children.
Yes.
We don't know why. I can't judge him for that. But I do think he was a holy man. Reportedly, his last words were, "Lord, I love you."
Yes.
So anyone who dies with that in that state of mind is probably not going to have much of a purgatory, especially considering his earthly suffering in terms of physical infirmity and whatever else.
Well, and perhaps the last 10 years watching the decomposition, the auto demolition, to use Paul VI's phrase, of the church right before his eyes. I mean,
well, of course, he may have had all the indulgences and which assured his immediate entry into the beatific vision. We don't know. Well, you know what? Since we have a canonization factory going now with what John Benari called the Halo Award for anyone that you want to honor, let's hope he gets canonized quickly so that we can then argue that Bergoglio has rescinded the legislation of his saintly predecessor.
Right. Well, to be honest, my prediction, I think Bergoglio is more likely to canonize himself than canonize Benedict XVI.
Yeah, I don't think he will canonize Benedict.
No.
We could be wrong. Let's hope we are.
Now, and again, particularly notwithstanding what we've said about what his personality, his deep compassion for people, which really does seem to be real, the opposite of what the news media and the political elites made of him. I mean, he was called the Rottweiler. He was mocked as sort of a Hitler supporter. I mean, he was sort of led to believe this sort of nasty Nazi-like figure, which, again, doctrinally, he was certainly not Pope Pius X, but even on a human level, not at all the caricature that the media gave him.
He had a collection of cat plates, for heaven's sake.
Right, exactly.
He's a very
Well,
gentle, very gentle man.
yes,
And some would say he was not very manly at all. He was kind of a softy. But again,
yes,
he did the right thing for the church with Summorum, which once again is exactly why the current occupant of the chair of Peter, as I call him, who was a destroyer, had to rescind that legislation. It was
yes.
standing in the way of his demolition project.
Well, and really the contrast of those two doctrines really summarizes the deep flaw in the legal positivism of the modern church, right? Benedict says, I'm not really doing anything because nobody could revoke what was sacred then is sacred now. Nobody can
Right.
abrogate this. And Francis, essentially, it's my will is law. Veto gone. I can change everything and anything that anybody did before me. I mean, really, those two acts, Traditionis Custodes and Summorum Pontificum, summarize the difference between a natural and divine law that limits authority and pure legal positivism that is on full display in the Francis.
Well, the current occupant of the chair of Peter runs the church like a Peronist party boss, as someone has said. He thinks the church is a political party. He's the head of the party, and he will tell the party what the next dictate is.
Yes.
So he's a dictatorial figure who has no respect for his predecessor, not even his living predecessor in an unprecedented situation. Certainly no respect for any of the popes before Vatican II or any church teaching before Vatican II. We've seen his ridiculous definition of tradition. He says that tradition comes from the root, but grows beyond the root, so that it always changes and develops. Well, that's utter nonsense, of course, because we know that tradition grows in the way that the oak tree grows from the acorn. It was always an oak tree. It was an oak tree at the beginning. It's an oak tree at the end. The only thing we see is development of the very same thing, which is, in this case, the deposit of faith.
Yeah, under him, you'd plant an oak acorn and get a lemon tree.
Yeah, well, that's what he wants. Or he wants to hack the limbs off the oak tree and graft something else on, which will die and is dying. The Novus Ordo, of course, is dying. They have no vocations.
Yes,
it's an old people's mass. Young people are flocking to the traditional mass, despite his best efforts to stop that. And by the way, to show what a nasty character he is, he says there must be something wrong with these young people. Remember his comment where he says, dig, 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 he says, and you will find that there's something wrong with these young folks who are attracted to the traditional liturgy. So here's a pope who descends to character assassination, calumny of millions of young people that don't agree with him in his reformist mania.
Well, absolutely. Well, to wrap this up, I think we just commend to our viewers. All we can really do is say a prayer for the repose of the soul of this really significant figure. Again, he, in addition to his reign as Pope, he much longer served again under John Paul II and did do what he could to some extent to restore some normalcy to the at least on the moral natural law level of the faith. And really all we can do for him now that he's met his judgment is to pray for the repose of his soul, something not often encouraged in the Novus Ordo. You're buried and then forgotten. Well, turning to more mundane matters, back here in as we're recording this, we're almost in the midst of a papal conclave. It sounds like in the House of Representatives, with multiple ballots with no white smoke emerging. Certainly referring to the election of the Speaker of the House of Representatives. The Republicans, of course, in the November elections took a slim majority in the House, and one of the first acts of a new Congress is to elect a Speaker. And as we record this, there's been 2 days and 6 ballots, and the heir apparent, who was self-proclaimed, Kevin McCarthy, has failed 6 times to garner a majority of votes. There's about a core of 20 Republicans have so far voted no, voted against him.
How dare they?
Sorry?
How dare they?
How dare they? Yeah, and that's really been the interesting thing about this story. McCarthy, or whatever the outcome is, you really see in this sort of theme, liberalism is not about everything they talk about, free elections and everybody expressing their views. It's really about what they really want is predetermined results where everything is just a rubber stamp. And, the news media is outraged that, how dare they not follow the party line and create, in their words, chaos. But isn't this actually what the Constitution called for? Right? An actual open vote among the members of Congress?
Oh no, we can't have that. And so when they talk about democracy and debate
Right.
and inclusivity and
Right.
openness. What they really mean, as my wife put it, is my way or the highway.
Yes.
So if you do what they want, then you're part of the inclusive group, the big tent, as they call it. But it's not a big tent. It's a very small tent. It's the donor classes, Tucker Carlson calls them, who call the
Yes.
shots with lobbying in Washington. And the 20 who are opposing McCarthy get ridiculed for saying that Washington is broken. Really? That's debatable? Of course
Right.
Washington is broken. They call it a platitude. Oh, so it's a platitude. Well, that means it's true, but they consider it to be
Campaign slogan.
a boring truth, or
Right.
so obvious that we can just yawn whenever anyone says that. Meaning, of course, that the broken Washington, D.C. must remain such. And this is all the defense of the status quo. The people who oppose McCarthy know that he is a chameleon. He'll say what he has to say to get what he wants, and then he'll turn around and say the opposite to get what he wants from someone else. They know this. Everyone knows this about McCarthy. He's a phony conservative. They call him a conservative. Although I have to say the alternative would be unthinkable. They're playing a dangerous game to some extent, because let's assume a number of Republicans begin to vote present under parliamentary rules. If they merely vote present, they don't go into the determination of the majority needed to elect a speaker. Now, right now, the Democrats have something like 202 votes for this Jeffries lunatic, right? So if the threshold is lowered enough by those voting present on the Republican side, the Democrats could conceivably have one of theirs elected Speaker of the House. Now, the 20 know this. And we'll see today if we see a lot of Republicans voting present. Yesterday on the vote to adjourn, one Republican voted present, which lowered the pertinent electorate in the House by one vote. So the majority would not have been altered significantly. But if 5 or 6 vote present today, you better start worrying that this could be a catastrophe. But on the other hand, who are we to say that they don't have the right to oppose someone that they look upon, rightly enough, as a figure of the establishment and the status quo, went along with this ridiculous omnibus spending bill?
Well, and again, another thing I found interesting about this is Donald Trump, who's really the last 2 months just been taking pot shots at his strongest supporters. I mean, recently blaming the pro-life movement for the failure of some Republicans get elected. Really showing this is having an effect, and he's losing a grip on I think his supporters, because he came out very strongly after the third vote, telling these Republicans to vote for McCarthy. And as a result, McCarthy actually lost a vote rather than gaining any. And it really sort of bizarre that, Trump, who won so much of the sort of traditionalist support, having his gay party in Mar-a-Lago last month and then turning on pro-life people this week, had zero effect on this. It really shows that not a good strategy.
I think his star is fading. It remains to be seen, but I don't see him getting the nomination in 2020, in 2023 or 2024. So we will see. We'll see.
Now, one interesting theory about this that I've been bantering around is what are these again? What are these 20 up to? Obviously, one is to make a point, right? That we are here not to do business as usual. Maybe that's part of it. They know they can't elect themselves. There's only 20 of them, but part of me thought maybe their point is nothing good can come out of this Congress, right? Remember, we've got the Senate as control of the Democrats. They have firm control now, even without the tie-breaking vote. We saw in the Disrespect for Marriage Act they passed the end of last year that there's traitor Republicans there who will support them. There's a razor-thin majority in the House that the Democrats, as you said, with picking up a couple of traitor Republicans, can do what they want. Maybe their game is, let's just drag this out. I mean, 100 years or over 150 years ago, they went for about 3 or 4 months without a speaker. And until that happens, nothing can happen. Washington shuts down. You can't pass any laws. So again, it's an interesting theory. Maybe their theory is the less time they have, the more damage they can do to our country.
Yeah, but I'm concerned about this parliamentary gimmick of voting present. So if 10 turncoat Republicans vote present, then you have what's the current majority?
228,
is it?
Yeah, or no, 224. I mean, it's
224. So that goes down to 214. Yes. You don't have a majority. So,
Yes.
and the Democrats could conceivably muster up a majority for either a consensus candidate or one of their own lunatics. You could end up with a crazy person as Speaker of the House.
Yeah.
But that depends upon whether they vote president. If they continue to vote
Yes.
and not merely vote president, this could go on forever. Maybe it should go on forever. Then that's what I love it when they say, well, there's a logjam in Congress, there's gridlock in Congress. Good.
Yes.
Don't pass any more laws, please. Don't do us any favors. Why don't you just all go home and leave us alone?
Yes.
Pass a
Exactly.
budget, pass a budget that might balance in 7 years, which is one of the demands of the 20, and then go home. Do nothing.
Exactly. Exactly. So, well, we will see. Again, maybe by the time you're viewing this, there will be an outcome. But the larger point is, again,
They're voting
it
right
is
now, by the way, as we speak.
they are. So we'll see. But again, the larger point is the attack of these 20 who, again, have every right as free thinking members of Congress. I mean, they're supposed to be elected not to be, party minions, but to represent their constituencies. That's the way the system was set up. But this imposition of a party system, which is nowhere in the Constitution, nowhere are political parties mentioned, has really grown in this sort of Marxist way that, as you say, even Pope Francis, obey the party leader or suffer the consequences, has really even taken over the whole political process.
And by the way, here we see the failure of James Madison's prophecy that there
Mm.
would never be dominant blocks maintaining a damaging status quo because there'd be so many factions that no one faction could ever gain power. He never foresaw that what he really had done was create a mass democracy, which coalesced into a two-party system, which is really a uniparty. It's one party.
Yes.
One wing of the party says we're going full steam ahead to destroy everything that remains of the moral order, and the other wing, the Republican wing, says not so fast.
Right.
But you go a little slower, please. But they've already given ground on gay marriage. Two men can marry each other. They recognize something called the trans community. Where did that come from? There was no trans community 5 years ago. So
Mm.
they've given ground on all these key issues, and really it's just a question of degree at this point. But then
Mm.
again, politics is the art of the possible. So we have a duty to mitigate damage to the common good by
Sure.
voting for the least harmful alternative. It's one of the rare instances in which one has to opt for the lesser of two evils, even though you're not the source of the evil, you're not choosing evil, you're mitigating the harm to the common good caused by a political process. And the church is
Yes.
clear on this, which is why Pius XII, by the way, said there was a moral obligation to vote against the communists in
Yes.
the election. I think it was 1942 or 1945. He said you'd be committing a mortal sin if you didn't go and vote against them. He even told the nuns in the convents to go out and vote against the communists, but they were voting in favor of basically a Masonic revolutionary party, which is
Yes.
everything else in Italy to the right of communism. Yet that's what we have to do. We have to mitigate harm to the common good. So I hope the 20 realize at some point, if they don't get more votes today, and if they start losing votes, that they better just cut a deal with McCarthy.
Yes. Hopefully, and again, we'll see. But it's going to be interesting up until 2024, and I'm sure as we get closer to the election, we'll do a show talking about how to assess whoever the nominee of the Republican Party is. Again, I think I agree with you. Trump's looking less and less likely to succeed at that. But
Well, as we speak right now, McCarthy has 30 votes, and Jeffries, the lunatic of the left, has 29. So we're not going to be on the air long enough to wait for the outcome, but next time we'll talk about it, I guess.
I guess. All right. Well, hey, thank you for joining us, Chris. Happy birthday, and we'll see you in a couple of weeks.
Take care. God bless.
All right.